Building on our discussion of decision making, I want to focus now on influence, power, and politics within organizations. And before we even really get into it, I kind of want to define what we're talking about when we're talking about influence, power, and politics. So, influence is the ability to control others at its most basic level. So, can you influence someone to do something for you? Can you influence someone to be productive? Can you influence someone to vote in a particular way? So a lot of corporations and a lot of organizations and a lot of individuals are very focused on the concept of influencing. Every advertisement you've ever seen in your life has been an attempt to influence you to either use a product, support a cause, support a candidate, or think differently about an organization. Power is more about, do you have what it takes to be more influencing? In other words, are you in a position that makes it easier or harder for you to successfully influence others? And when we talk about politics in an organization, politics in an organizational setting is almost always viewed as a negative. And you may have your own opinions of politics outside of organizations. So basically, the politics that we normally think of, the political systems that govern our country and other countries. When we talk about politics within an organization, we usually define it as any behaviors that are about increasing your own influence and your own power in contrast or against the organization's good. So politics is effort and time spent to self-promote in such a way that it does not benefit the organization's goals. So just recognize that when we're talking about politics within organizations, we're usually talking about a negative. The final thing before we really get into discussing this in more detail is that when we're measuring influence and power, we're not necessarily measuring social acceptability or good versus evil, for instance. We're really just looking at how much power does the person have, where does that power come from, and how do they use that power to influence others for good or ill. And anyone that is in a high position of power with a large amount of influence probably does still make mistakes. So we also need to recognize that there is both positives and negatives to influence and power. So let's talk a little bit about the basic definition. Social influence or influence is attempts to have an effect on another person in a desired fashion, whether or not those attempts are successful. So when we talk about trying to influence someone, we're talking about the attempt to affect another person in a desired fashion, not necessarily whether it's successful or not. Also, when we're thinking about organizations, the influences that are being attempted are usually towards organizational goals. So the organization is trying to influence both the customers, the clients, the stakeholders, or the people that work within the company towards a certain behavior, towards a certain buying pattern, or towards a certain set of beliefs about the organization. Power is defined as the potential to successfully influence others, the capacity to have that desired effect. In other words, how much power someone has will dictate how successful their attempts to social influence someone generally will be. Now, that doesn't mean that this is a zero-sum game or an automatic. So just because someone has an enormous amount of power does not mean they're always going to be successful in influencing. And someone with very little power may be successful in influencing. However, generally speaking, we do find a strong relationship with the more power and the more types of power that an individual has, the more likely they'll be successful in influencing. So again, I just want to think about these two things separately. Power is your potential or your capacity, and power comes from many different sources that we'll discuss, to influence, and influence is the actual behaviors or attempts to have an effect on other persons or people in a desired fashion. So when we think of social influence, we also need to recognize that sometimes the people that have the most influence may not necessarily have the most power. So the person pictured here is Anton Drexler. Many people quietly give him credit for the rise of Nazi Germany at the start of the 20th century. He was one of the initial thinkers. He was considered a mentor to the person that became the face of the Nazi movement in Germany. However, there was an enormous amount of influence this person had, though not necessarily a lot of power. Now, of course, this then led to someone with a lot more power that used these same concepts and same desires and same thoughts to influence a much greater number of people. So we also want to think about where influence is coming and recognize that influence Though more successful when driven by power, there can be enormous effects of social influence for those that don't necessarily or are not necessarily perceived as having enormous amounts of power. So let's talk a little bit about the principles of influencing. So the first thing is things that'll include the likelihood of someone being successful at influencing. Friendship and liking. The more we like other people or feel friendship for them, or the more we feel like that they are someone we look up to, someone we like, the more likely we are to comply with their requests or to accept other forms of influence from them. It's one of the reasons why a lot of advertisements tend to use famous people and famous people endorsements. Those people have become famous because in general their acting, their skills, or even just their looks are well liked by people. And therefore it's assumed, and it's been strongly supported by research on how human people make decisions, humans, um, that it does influence the likelihood to influence. The next thing we can look at is commitment or consistency. So when we're looking at commitment consistency, once individuals have adapted a position or committed themselves to a course of action, they experience a strong pressure to comply with requests that are consistent with these initial commitments. In other words, it's one of the reasons why you see a whole bunch of signs pop up in people's yards in the election, whether it's a national election or a local election. You know when an election's coming up because you see all the yard signs. Well, one, they're trying to get name recognition out there. They're trying to get familiarity of their candidate. But there is another part of this. If they can get you to agree to put a sign out on your yard, they've just greatly increased the likelihood that you as an individual voter will not only vote for the person, but will also vote in general. So putting a yard sign out is strongly correlated with voting for the person that you have committed to with that small commitment, that yard sign, but also increases the chance that you actually do go and vote when the election comes. So the more commitment we can get from people, and once they've made that commitment, it's a lot easier to influence them to continue. So if you get someone to question about vaccines, just question. That's all you need to do. But once they start to question, they've now started to look down this road, and it becomes easier and easier to convince people to be against vaccines. Regardless of what your personal attitudes versus vaccines is, this works in both ways. If you can get someone to commit to vaccines are useful, it's very easy to get that person to continue to be influenced to further and further support vaccines. And this can be a problem on both ends. If you're anti-vaccine, you tend to very quickly become anti-all vaccines. While there may be some vaccines that are very useful and are better supported as science, less side effects, less negative effects, and much more positive effects for society and for the individual. But likewise, if you become pro-vaccine, in other words, you're very supportive of vaccines, you probably start supporting all vaccines, even if there are some that may have some issues. So we tend to commit to our ideals, and once we've made a commitment, we tend to like consistency in those ideals. And this is something that also affects influence. So if you're looking to influence someone, you want to influence them a little bit to begin with to start them down that road of commitment and consistency. Other principles of influence: scarcity. Requests that emphasize the scarcity or the fact that that some object, opportunity, outcome will soon no longer be available are difficult to resist. Order now while supplies last. If you've ever gotten a spam emails truly often use this scarcity concept. It'll basically suggest that something horrible is going to happen unless you respond immediately. They want you to click on that link. They want you to provide your sign-in information without thinking too much about it. That is playing on this scarcity. But also, again, the more scarce something is, the more likely it is to be seen as valuable, and the more likely it is we are going to commit to it. So if you're trying to influence someone, again, one of the ways to increase the chance of successfully influencing someone is to make it sound like it needs to be acted upon quickly before it goes away. And I can tell you as a fact, this works very well on me. One of the easiest ways to get me to buy something that I'm not that interested in buying is to convince me that soon it won't be available at all. If there is any chance I'd buy that product, I will now buy it. So that is an example of scarcity. So if it was going to be available for the next 30 or 40 years, I probably would never buy it. Tell me it's going out of business and the company will be gone in 3 months, might as well buy it now while I still can. Another principle of influence is reciprocity. Individuals generally experience powerful pressure to reciprocate benefits they've received from others. It's one of the reasons that a lot of organizations do free samples. Now, this doesn't work on everyone, and it doesn't have this overall effect of automatic success. But when someone gives you a free sample of a product, if you really haven't got a strong attitude one way or the other to the competing products, you are more likely to now buy that product out of reciprocity. It's one of the reasons that a lot of charitable organizations will send you a small gift right off the bat as they ask for a donation. It's again trying to play off that reciprocity. We've already done something nice for you, why don't you do something nice for us? Now, the more we are bombarded by these techniques, generally the less useful they are, the less successful they are. But they are still more successful than not using these techniques. So for example, if I sent out a letter asking for a $10 donation to 10,000 people with no gift included, and then I sent that same exact request for $10 donation to 10,000 people with a small gift included, I would find the small gift included people would be more likely, not all of them, but some of them, to actually donate. I would see a greater return on my investment. And I would generally see a return on my investment that would easily pay for that small gift. So when we start thinking about that, we were talking about influence and the things we can do to increase the likelihood of anyone having success influencing. We now want to think about individual power, or the power someone has to influence. And it's broken down into two broad categories: position power and personal power. Position power is based on one's formal position within an organization and often does not necessarily come with any type of fame. For example, pictured here is Steve Burke, former CEO of NBC Universal, someone with an enormous amount of power, an enormous amount of wealth, but probably someone that no one's ever really heard of. On the other side is personal power, the power that one derives because of his or her individual qualities or characteristics. And pictured here is Oprah Winfrey, who, though she does actually have companies, is far more influencing because of her personal persona, her access to fame, and how she basically communicates with her followers and the people that like her through her various entertainment platforms. So again, when we look at individual power, we have position power, which includes legitimate power, reward power, coercive power, and information power. And we have personal power, which includes rational persuasion, referent power, expert power, and charisma. And we're going to talk about each of these four subcategories of position power and personal power next. Obviously, the way we're going to be using this in organizations, advertising, or any attempt to influence, is we want to make sure that the person is bringing as much actual types of power to their attempt to influence. So obviously, if I have a choice between someone that no one knows and someone that's well loved and well known and is famous, I'm going to choose that famous person if I can to influence. If that person also then can make a rational argument, has made positive arguments in the past, is seen as an expert in this particular field, and has charisma, all the better. Likewise, if I have someone that's in a position power, so they have legitimate power, they're the CEO of a company, do they also control the rewards of the organization? Do they also have the ability to coerce people, in other words, fire people? And do they also control information in the organization? All of those will again increase the likelihood or the success of any attempts that they make to influence. So when we look at individual power, it breaks down to position power and personal power. And then within position power, we have legitimate, reward, coercive, and informational. And within personal power, we have rational, expert, referent, and charisma. We're going to talk about each of these in turn, obviously, in the next few slides. But this is a great overview slide just to remind ourselves that when we're trying to influence people, and within organizations, we're probably trying to influence them to higher productivity, less absenteeism, less counterwork behavior, and more positive behaviors. The more we can bring upon all of these 8 subcategories, the more influence that someone will have. So you can start to think of some people that have both position and personal power. I will use the example of Elon Musk. Whether you like him or dislike him, he is famous. He has personal power. He also has position power. He is the CEO of his various companies, which gives him legitimate power. He definitely has reward power. If you want to get ahead in one of his companies, you definitely want to do things his way. And he definitely has coercive power. If you're not agreeing with his thoughts on how a company should be ran, he definitely has the ability to remove you from the organization. And most of his companies are in the high-tech field that are also interacting with international laws and international expectations, so their information is also something he controls. At the same time, he has personal power. He is seen as someone that is charismatic, especially by some. And again, every person that has any type of power will find the examples that people like or dislike this person. I'm just asking you to think about it rationally and to go through the process of where does this person's power comes from. One might argue that he makes rational persuasions. Other people might claim that he's being irrational. Some people would claim that he's definitely has expert power. At least he projects that. He has the degrees. He is involved in the engineering. How much he's involved and how innovative he is, that is definitely up for debate. So we can see that this person would be an example of someone that has a lot of individual power. Now, you might also think of like a Hollywood star or starlet that actually is advertising something. Maybe all they have is personal power, charisma. They may not have been known for supporting this project in the past. They may not be seen as an expert in this project, and they might not even be making a rational persuasion other than, I'm famous, you like me, you should buy this product too. So if we look at organizational position power, there's the four types. Legitimate power, the individual power base derived from one's position in an organizational hierarchy, the accepted authority of one's position. In other words, legitimate power often happens in well-structured bureaucracies. A captain or a colonel in the military has legitimate power. A CEO or CFO or a senior director has legitimate power within an organization. A representative, a senator, or the president, or a Supreme Court judge has legitimate power. The next is reward power, the individual's power base derived from an individual's capacity to administer valued rewards to others. So you can have legitimate power without reward power. So the more you have of these four types, the more successful your influencing is going to be. So let's example, I have legitimate power. I'm a director in an organization. However, I do not have direct control over whether someone gets rewards. That's a senior director's position. That means I have legitimate power, but I don't have reward power. That senior director would have legitimate power and reward power. Coercive power is the individual power base derived from a capacity to administer punishments to others. And again, you can see that some people might have the ability to provide rewards or bonuses, but not necessarily be able to terminate someone without going through a greater series of HR steps. For example, an administrative plan of improvement might also be an example of a coercive power, but might not be directly in the hands of the person that directly supervises the person with legitimate power. And finally, there's informational power, the extent to which one supervisor provides the subordinate with the information needed to do one job. In other words, if you have the ability to control the information that's flowing to the people that you have power over, and you can adjust what information they're getting, or even whether or not they can succeed at their job based on the information they're giving, this also gives you power. Now, all four of these can happen in isolation. Someone might have informational power without any other form of power. They don't have a legitimate position. They're basically a colleague. They don't have reward or coercive power, but they're the person that's in charge of core information on what the legal systems are. So, for example, a lot of lawyers and legal administrators in organizations have a lot of information power. They don't have direct control over anyone, but you want to pay attention when they're telling you something about what can and cannot be done. Likewise, the people that have coercive power may not have information power. The people that have reward power may not have coercive or information power. Generally, reward and coercive power includes legitimate power, but again, it depends on the organization. When we look at personal power, we have again four. We have rational persuasion, so using logical arguments and factual evidence to convince others that an idea is acceptable. Expert power, the individual power based derived from the individual's recognized superior skills and abilities in a certain area. Referent power, the individual power base determined from the degree to which one is liked and admired by others. In other words, how much do we refer to that person? And finally, charisma, an attitude of enthusiasm and optimism that is contagious, an aura of leadership. So again, you can see how all of these could exist in isolation. Someone might be charismatic, but not necessarily well-liked without any expertise and not making a rational argument. Someone could be making a rational argument that is not necessarily perceived as an expert, isn't necessarily well-liked, and isn't necessarily charismatic. Someone might be an expert and not necessarily be using a rational persuasion. So again, we want to think about how individuals can use these various tools, but also, again, the goal always is that if we're truly trying to inspire and influence others, we want to use as many of these possible. And we want to use both personal and position power in tandem. We want to be using all of these. We're hoping that our official legitimate power holder is also charismatic, is also well liked, is also seen as an expert, and is making rational persuasions when they're using their personal or position power. So this was just a quick study that basically was asking a large group of CEOs how often they use the various types of power. And you can see here that when we look at them, there's not a huge difference. Most common position power obviously is legitimate. I make decisions based on my position and people are expected to follow. But notice that reward, coercion, and information are also being used a fair amount as well. And if we look at personal power, again, the number one is going to be expertise, but it's quickly followed by charisma, and that you can see in our advertisements. And rational persuasion and referent is not too far behind. So again, this is evidence that all 8 of these types of power are regularly being used, both in interpersonal influences, organizational influences, political influences, and of course, advertising influences. So I want to end on this pretty simple model that kind of tries to put all these ideas into one place. So again, our personal characteristics and our organizational position leads into power. Power then basically is going to determine how successful or unsuccessful we are in our attempts to influence. And organizational politics and legitimate behavior are both going to affect this. So if there is a motive to satisfy personal interest, that can decrease the success of influence. But if we have a motivation to satisfy organizational goals, legitimate behavior, that increases the chance. So the person trying to influence within an organization is going to bring their personal characteristics and their organizational position into their attempt to influence. If they're influencing to satisfy organizational goals, they're much more likely to succeed. So hopefully that gives you a kind of an overview model of how to think about influence, the attempt to actually change people's opinions, to motivate, to endorse, to change ideas and thoughts and behaviors, and power, a trait that allows us to be more successful at influencing. So we're going to pick this up in the next module and continue to talk about influence, power, and politics as we continue this interesting subject.